Hello everyone, and welcome to one of the interviews with the experts, part of the Erasmus Plus founded project team, Teacher Education about Multilingualism. My name is Roberta Spelorzi, and together with my PhD colleague Mattia Zingaretti, we'll be talking about the concept of language attrition in bilingual language development with one of the world's leading authorities in the field, Antonella Sorace, Professor of Developmental Linguistics at the University of Edinburgh and Honorary Professor at University College London.
Antonella's extensive research over the years has focused on a number of interrelated questions that bring together linguistics, experimental psychology and cognitive science, and her research achievements and publications span different subfields of scientific inquiry. Antonella has also been committed to disseminating the findings of research on bilingualism outside academia. She is the funding director of the Research and Information Center Bilingualism Matters, with 31 branches in 3 different continents. Now, let's get to know our expert. Ciao Antonella, come va?
Ciao, benissimo, grazie.
It's great to have you here. So today we will be picking your brain on a research topic which I'm sure you know lots about. I'm talking about language attrition. So just in a few words, could you please define what the concept is for our viewers and listeners?
Thank you very much for the question and for the invitation. Language attrition is a very normal and predictable process that happens when 2 languages are in contact with one another. The term is a little bit negative, right? Attrition denotes erosion, loss. And in fact, that was the original meaning of the term attrition when research on attrition started. And original research was done on migrant populations that really left their country for good. A century ago, there was no way of going back or keeping in touch. And so the initial studies on attrition focused on this kind of migrant population. Now the research on attrition has broadened up, and in fact it has been discovered that attrition is a perfectly normal process that happens to all language learners or bilinguals in a broad sense, whether they learn a language early on in life or whether they learn another language as adults. So it refers to some reciprocal adjustments of the native language and the second language.
Right. Okay, that's fascinating. It's a great introduction to the topic. So could you give some examples of attrition in real life for our viewers and listeners?
Right. Attrition, I would like to say, first of all, that the effects of a first language on a second language have been very well documented. But what we are talking about is the potential effects of the second language on the first language. And this is what people normally refer to with the term attrition. But as I said, we're talking about reciprocal effects of each language on one another, which, by the way, might be a good thing for language learning. They may be functional to proficient language learning. So we're talking about, probably, but we need a lot more research, about really a kind of adjustment of the linguistic space in the brain of a language learner or a bilingual, so that these changes actually serve a purpose and facilitate the process of learning another language and reaching a high level of competence in that language. Now, you asked about examples. So much research has been done on lexical attrition. That means attrition on vocabulary, finding words in your mental vocabulary. And definitely one of the effects of attrition in this domain is that finding words becomes a bit slower. I mean, not so slow in many cases that, we are aware this is happening. But if we do research in the lab, we discover that access And, you know, finding words in your mental lexicon, in your mental vocabulary, becomes a little bit slower. Also, there may be interference, you know, from one language to the other. So we're all Italian, right? I mean, if I'm a trited, you know, an Italian attrited speaker, I might want to say sugo, sauce, but the word sauce is easier to find. And so I use the, you know, I tend to use the word sauce. I may self-correct myself. Or, you know, I may use the word library in Italian to refer to, you know, a library in English, but in fact, library, libreria in Italian means a different thing, right? It means a bookshop. So this kind of phenomena are found at the lexical level within the vocabulary. If we're talking about grammar, it becomes even more interesting because we're talking about effects that don't necessarily lead to mistakes or, you know, wrong production, but they lead to more variation. Speakers experiencing attrition use a wider range of forms that compared to a less bilingual or a monolingual speaker who speaks only one language. So, you know, we've done research on pronouns, for example, which means, you know, I, you, he, she, and in a language like Italian, there is a tendency to use more pronouns than a monolingual person would do. Also, there may be effects on word order, the way we order words in a sentence. You know, a tendency to say, for example, instead of saying, so the equivalent of what happened, John arrived, you know, in Italian would be cosa è successo? È arrivato Giovanni. But, you know, as a result of attrition, we might say cosa è successo? Giovanni è arrivato. This is not a mistake. It's not, you know, obviously wrong, but it's a little bit weird and it indicates a process of change in progress.
Well, how interesting, Antonella. I'm sure that our viewers and listeners, especially our students of foreign languages in school, might be curious to know if they could experience attrition to some extent. And so can you expand a little bit more on who precisely attrition affects?
We need more research on this. We think that attrition is a normal and predictable process, but obviously the bilingual experience, what we call the bilingual experience, might have an effect on when attrition appears, or, you know, how quickly the results of attrition, the effects of attrition actually become visible, and so on. So we can't actually say, oh, it will happen this way for everybody in all contexts. But if somebody is fully immersed in a second language environment, we might predict that, you know, there will be attrition effects. When exactly they will start, that's a very good question, you know, for researchers, and we're trying to address that question with further research. But again, it's not something to worry about. It's not, you know, it doesn't mean that you lose your language. It means that your language starts changing a little bit in ways that you may not be even aware of, but that is good in some respects from the point of view of learning the second language.
Well, in fact, I think some of our viewers and listeners might be worried about the concept of losing, yes, the first language, so you just mentioned. Could you just expand a little bit more on this concept of not losing the first language, please?
Yes, we have evidence, for example, from research that these changes can be partly undone. So if people go back to their original country, their original community, there is some evidence that these changes due to attrition tend to revert or regress to the original state. So again, this for us means that these changes are not permanent. These changes don't mean that people lose their language. It just means that these adjustments are functional to living in another community, learning another language, using the other language on a regular basis. So this is very good evidence that, again, these processes are not permanent. Now, the interesting question is what happens to the children of people experiencing attrition, so the next generation. And that's when, the story gets even more exciting, because obviously these speakers provide input to their children. So, for example, my children learned Italian from me, and the Italian they heard from me is not the same kind of Italian that I heard from my parents while I was growing up in Italy. And so that means that at that point, we might start talking about language change in the much longer run. And some cases of language change over time, alive languages, languages that are actually spoken actively by many people, naturally change. Languages that don't change anymore are dead. So again, this is not something to worry about. It's a natural phenomenon. But attrition in first generation people might partly explain how languages might change in the long run.
Well, extremely fascinating and also complex. Now I wonder about what happened to language teachers that live in abroad and that teaching their first language. How the change of input, the frequency of the use would impact their L1, their first language.
Again, this is predictable and this is nothing to worry about. It doesn't mean that they're not very good teachers or they can't teach their language anymore. And let's bear in mind that these days there are lots of sources of input available. Internet, social media, you name it. So it's not just, teachers shouldn't feel that they're the only source of input for their students. But even if they were, I wouldn't worry about that. Again, these changes produce more variation, as we said, in many ways, at the level of vocabulary, at the level of grammar, but it doesn't mean that these teachers are teaching the wrong language to their students.
Right, okay. Well, so I think we've heard a lot now about how attrition appears, who it affects, what kind of consequences it has for language teachers, language learners, and also how long these effects last. So just to conclude today, Antonella, what is your take-home message that you would like to send our viewers and listeners?
I would like to say again that attrition is a normal phenomenon. It's part of being bilingual or becoming bilingual in a broad sense. It's part of having more than one language in the brain. It's part of regarding bilinguals not as the sum of two monolinguals. This is a very important principle, right? A bilingual is not the sum of two monolinguals, and they shouldn't be expected to behave like monolingual in language A and monolingual in language B. And understanding attrition is precisely part of this, new concept. We should really regard bilinguals as bilinguals or multilinguals, more than two. And attrition as natural change is part of the process.
That's a wonderful message, Antonella. Roberta and I hope that you have enjoyed watching this interview and learning more about language attrition, bilingualism, and their implications in everyday life. If you want to learn more about these topics and other related phenomena, you can have a look at the other materials on the Team Project website. Thank you so much, Antonella, for your time today. Grazie mille.
Prego.
Thank you very much.
Grazie a voi.